May 27, 1969, western A Shau Valley, Thừa Thiên Province, late afternoon, but the light was already draining out of the sky, swallowed by low monsoon clouds rolling in from Laos. The air was thick enough to drink, wet heat, rotting leaves, wood smoke from some unseen village fire, and the faint metallic promise of rain. On a narrow spur of black rock that jutted above a jungle-choked saddle the Americans had labeled on their maps as Checkpoint Cobra. One Green Beret lay flat behind a jagged outcrop, his face streaked with mud and dried blood, eyes locked on the tree line below. Staff Sergeant Jack Rourke looked like a man clinging to the rim of the world, and in a way, he was. On the map back at Fire Support Base Jackson, the saddle beneath him was just a shallow dip between two ridges, a contour line squeezed tight on a 150,000 sheet. But for the men who had tried to cross it, the place had earned a different name. Patrols from the 101st Airborne had been chewed up there, convoys ambushed, helicopters raked by heavy machine guns hidden under the canopy, long-range reconnaissance teams erased as if the jungle decided to swallow them whole. Word had spread faster than any typed report. That patch of Vietnam became known in mess tents, hooches and bunker talk by one simple name: certain death. Rourke heard the stories long before he saw the terrain. A squad leader from the 327th Infantry had once shown him a crooked scar on his calf and called it his souvenir from certain death. A radio operator had drawn a tiny skull in pencil at the edge of his map sheet where the saddle lay. Even the Montagnard tribesmen attached to the Special Forces camp would go quiet when the valley's local name was mentioned, their eyes drifting to the western hills as if measuring some old invisible threat. It was almost inevitable that someone would eventually ask the Green Berets to go in. Rourke belonged to Detachment A-341, 5th Special Forces Group, based out of a rough camp carved into the valley's eastern lip. Their job was to work with local civilian irregular defense group, CIDG, forces, mostly Montagnard fighters, to pry open the jungle and keep the North Vietnamese from using A Shau as a private highway. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had different ideas. For them, the valley was a corridor of life, a funnel that carried men, mortars and ammunition down from Laos into the heart of our corps. By 1969, the war had shifted. The big set-piece fights that reporters liked to photograph had given way to something leaner and more elusive. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had turned the border regions into fortified belts, deep bunkers, overlapping anti-aircraft guns, camouflage caches buried under untouched-looking jungle. The Viet Cong, VC, still moved through villages by night and laid clever ambushes, but in valleys like A Shau, it was regular NVA regiments that ruled, mixing guerrilla patience with conventional firepower. American commanders were desperate to disrupt the arteries those units used to move. Every truck that slipped through the valley carried not just supplies, but the next firefight. Intelligence reports had kept repeating the same thing for weeks. An NVA platoon, 30, maybe more, was transiting the certain death saddle as a waypoint on a larger movement from Laos. They'd travel mostly at night, lay up in spider holes or rock overhangs by day. Direction finding and intercepted fragments of radio traffic hinted at a larger formation staging just across the border. The platoon was the probing finger of that bigger hand. If someone could find them and kill them on the saddle, it might blow open the route they used and let artillery and air power cut deeper into the hidden convoys behind them. On the operations board, it looked simple. Recon and interdiction of enemy movement corridor. Grid WT-284-641 to WT-296-655. In the ragged tent where the Green Berets drank thick coffee and wiped sleep from their eyes, it sounded different. "They want us to walk through certain death with a glow stick in our teeth," one sergeant muttered. Rourke sat quiet, turning his battered Zippo between his fingers, thinking about the saddle, the stories, the thin pencil line on the acetate overlay. He was 30, thick-shouldered and steady-eyed, a former ranch kid from eastern Oregon who'd traded snow and fence lines for jungle heat and ridgelines. The Army had given him a Car-15 that felt like an extra limb, an M79 grenade launcher whose arcs he could feel in his bones, a PRC-25 radio whose hiss told him more than some officers could. Special Forces training had added languages, demolitions, small unit tactics. Vietnam had added the one lesson no schoolhouse could, what it meant when people you'd never met woke up determined to kill you. In the briefing shack, his team sergeant, Master Sergeant Top Hanley, slid an acetate overlay onto the map and tapped a small hooked spur overlooking the saddle. "We put a small recon element here," he said. "High ground, good observation. You watch them move through, you call in artillery on their heads. In theory, simple." "Who's you?" someone asked. Hanley's gaze lifted and settled on Rourke. "Him." 4 nights later, that's how he ended up alone behind a jagged basalt boulder high above certain death. He hadn't started alone. He and a Montagnard scout named Jerome had climbed the spur under cover of darkness, hauling claymores, extra ammunition, and a radio up through slick roots and moss-slick stone. Before dawn, artillery somewhere in the valley had begun to thump, probing suspected enemy positions. One random mortar round, fired blind by the NVA at a distant helicopter landing zone, walked up the ridgeline like it had a map of its own. It landed close enough to rip the world apart. Jerome died, stringing a second claymore along the spur's spine, shredded in an instant. The blast threw Rourke into darkness. When he woke, his left ear screamed with a high electric whine. Shrapnel had traced a hot line along his ribs and left his side sticky, but his lungs still pulled air. The radio, by some private miracle, still worked. He spent the rest of the night and half the morning turning the exposed rock into something closer to a fighting nest. He dragged Jerome's rucksacks into cover, checked ammunition, repositioned the surviving claymores, and oriented his entire world around the strip of jungle below. By midday, the valley had become an oven. Cicadas shrieked from the canopy. The humidity settled on him like a hot, wet blanket. The saddle lay in shadow, a darker cut in the ridgeline, where the trees seemed thicker, as if they'd grown fat on blood. Somewhere beyond his line of sight, on the opposite ridge and in the gullies that led into Laos, the NVA were moving. He knew their doctrine. Squads and platoons in single-file movement, spaced out, each man trained to vanish off the trail the instant the shooting started. He respected them the way a climber respects gravity, coldly, realistically. Underestimate them, and you didn't get a second lesson. He pressed the radio handset to his cheek, feeling the plastic slick with sweat. "Firebase Jackson, this is Red Eye 3-1, he murmured. "Radio check, over." "Red Eye 3-1 Jackson, read you 5x5. Sitrep, over." The voice on the other end was young, a lieutenant who had never seen the western wall of the valley with his own eyes. "Single U.S. Special Forces at observation post, 1 CIDG KIA, Rourke said, glancing toward the poncho-covered shape where Jerome lay. "Good eyes on saddle. Awaiting enemy movement. Request artillery remain on standby for immediate fire mission. Danger close. Over." There was a pause. Even in a safe bunker, danger close made people think. Artillery didn't care what your unit flash was once it came down. "Copy, Red Eye 3-1. Artillery on standby. Call the grid, we'll send steel. You're approved to remain in place. Jackson out. Remain in place." As if there was any place else he could go. The spur was too narrow for a helicopter set down, the canopy too dense for an easy rope extraction. With NVA guns watching the valley, any helicopter that tried to hover long enough to pluck him off the rock would be chewed apart. He was on that spur until the mission was finished, or the jungle erased him like it had erased so many others. He checked his weapons again with the calm of ritual. Car-15 close at hand, 6 magazines stacked like a little graveyard of brass and lead. The M79 rested beside him, a short arc gun that could drop 40mm rounds neatly into gullies. A captured RPD light machine gun, taken from a dead NVA sapper weeks earlier, leaned against the rock, its belt of 7.62 39mm draped like an ugly scarf. Claymores fronted the most likely approach paths. Smoke grenades and a pencil flare lay within reach for marking or signaling. One man, but a great deal of bite. Hours crawled. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Once, far off, anti-aircraft guns coughed into the clouds, their tracers licking at some unseen aircraft. Sweat trickled into his eyes. Stinging, he blinked it away. His wounded side ached with every breath. Then, late in the afternoon, the jungle moved wrong. Not much. A band of leaves on the saddle held still while everything around them fluttered in the breeze. His eyes locked on the anomaly. A second later, through a narrow gap between trunks, he saw the faint arc of a conical helmet, just visible where no helmet should be. North Vietnamese, no question. Very slowly he brought the Car-15 to his shoulder, careful not to shift his silhouette. He let his breathing shallow, heartbeat slowing, the world narrowing down to that one helmet on that one strip of cursed ground. Somewhere behind that man, if the reports were right, an entire NVA platoon was winding its way towards certain death. Up on the spur, invisible and alone, the man sent to watch them waited for the moment when he would trade silence for violence, knowing that once he lit this match, the entire valley might catch fire. The saddle filled with ghosts. What had been an empty strip of jungle became, in slow motion, a moving artery of men. From his perch, Rourke watched the NVA platoon appear piece by piece. A point man in a faded uniform and rubber sandals, AK-47 held low but ready. 10 meters behind him, another soldier, then another, each man offset slightly, tracking the same invisible line across the ground. They moved with disciplined economy. A long RPD barrel slid through the foliage, carried by a wiry gunner with spare belts draped over his shoulders. 2 men with RPG-2 launchers picked their steps carefully, warheads wrapped in cloth. Combat packs rode high on sweat-darkened backs. Every 4th or 5th man carried extra ammunition or a radio. They stepped around a shallow crater where some previous mine had blown and skirted a charred patch where a helicopter had once slammed into the earth. The saddle wore its history and scars, and the NVA moved around them like water around stones. Textbook, he thought. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had drilled this kind of movement into its soldiers for years. Move light, keep discipline, expect ambush, survive it. In the valleys along the border, they backed that discipline with layered defenses. Anti-aircraft guns on the ridges, command-detonated mines guarding likely landing zones, sapper teams ready to slip through wire. The Americans had air power and artillery. The NVA had patience and a willingness to keep sending men down the same deadly corridors until one group finally got through. He counted them as they passed, lips moving silently. 5, 9, 15. By the time he hit 30, there were still men coming. A full platoon, maybe more. Near the center of the column, he saw the man who had to be the platoon leader, a map case on his side, a pistol at his hip. That slight pause and look each time the terrain changed. The NVA officer stopped at the low point of the saddle, turned, and surveyed his column. For a heartbeat, he stood framed in a shallow notch between trees, chest open, head barely visible above the undergrowth. Rourke exhaled and settled the front sight on the man's sternum. "Firebase Jackson, this is Red Eye 3-1, he whispered into the handset. "Enemy platoon in the open on saddle, grid WT-291-648. Estimate 30+. Request immediate fire mission, high explosive, battery 3, danger close. Over." The lieutenant answered quickly now, urgency in his voice even through static. "Red Eye 3-1 Jackson. Copy enemy platoon at WT-291-648. Battery 3 online. Can you adjust?" "Affirmative," Rourke said. "Target is open saddle between ridges, approximately 150 meters below my position. No friendlies in vicinity aside from this station. I'll mark with smoke when you're ready." Enemy in motion, time critical. Over. Copy. First round's 3 mics. Stand by to mark. Jackson out. 3 minutes. Enough time for the entire platoon to vanish into cover. Enough time to die if he mishandled it. He eased the radio aside and returned to the rifle. The NVA officer had shifted, gesturing his men off the main trail into the surrounding brush, decompressing the column. Exactly the right thing to do in a choke point. Good tactics. It would also expose more men when the shells came in. He waited until the platoon leader turned back toward the head of the column, mouth opening to shout an order. Then he squeezed the trigger. The CAR-15 cracked, the shot snapping across the valley, sharp and flat. The officer jerked backward as the round punched through his chest, a spray of red mist almost invisible in the thick air. For a second he staggered, arms flailing, then collapsed into the leaves. Silence held for a sliver of time. Then the valley exploded. Shouts in Vietnamese ripped through the jungle. Men dove for cover. Some dropped prone where they stood. Others hurled themselves behind tree trunks and termite mounds. AKs began to stutter in panicked bursts, muzzle flashes winking along the trail. Rounds tore into the slope below Rourke's position, chewing leaves and splintering branches, searching for the shooter they couldn't see. He fired again, staying on semi-auto, letting training override adrenaline. One shot folded an RPD gunner who had just swung his weapon up. Another clipped a man fumbling with an RPG, sending the launcher tumbling away. He shifted angles constantly, never shooting from the same notch twice, giving the enemy nothing solid to bracket. "Jackson, this is Red Eye 3-1, he shouted into the handset between shots. "Contact! Enemy platoon in heavy engagement with this station on saddle at WT 291-648. Fire mission now, danger close, over. Red Eye 3-1, Jackson, rounds outbound. Time to splash 1 minute. Mark your position, over." He let the rifle hang on its sling long enough to pull a smoke grenade, yank the pin, and roll it down the rock face beside him. It snagged on a root and began to spew thick green smoke that curled up in a twisted column. NVA shouted fresh commands. Some fired at the smoke, misunderstanding. Others began to orient toward the rock spur itself, tracing the angle of his shots back toward their source. Rourke grabbed the M79 and thumbed a 40mm round into the breach. Through a gap, he spotted 4 soldiers who had dived behind a fallen log halfway across the saddle, their helmets just visible over the wood. He raised the sight, adjusted by instinct for distance and slope, and fired. The grenade arced in a slow, high curve, a lazy thing against the low sky, then dropped and detonated just beyond the log. The explosion blew bark, leaves, and men into the air. "Splash! 45 seconds, the artillery net reported, voice calm and distant. The NVA responded with the professionalism he expected. A team broke off on the left, trying to work upslope and flank his position. Another group rushed toward the opposite ridge, seeking a vantage point to hit the spur from an angle. Somewhere, a heavier gun opened up, sending longer, steadier bursts of tracers toward the rocks near him. Bullets slapped into stone, spraying chips into his face. One clipped the rim of his helmet with a metallic ring that left his ears humming. He kept sliding, firing, sliding again. 3 rounds here into a knot of shapes trying to drag a wounded man. 2 more there into a shadow that seemed to be crawling closer. He could feel his heart pounding, but his hands stayed steady. Then the artillery arrived. The first rounds came in with a rising shriek that punched straight through bone. Then the world below erupted. High explosive shells slammed into the saddle, hurling trees, earth, and men into the air. Shockwaves rolled up the slope, hammering his chest and flattening leaves in concentric rings. Dirt and fragments blew skyward, turned briefly to mud in the air as the valley's latent moisture grabbed them. "Drop 200, left 50, he barked into the radio as the first impacts walked slightly long and right. "You're overshooting. Enemy still clustered in the saddle, attempting to flank left. Copy, Red Eye 3-1. Adjusting. Next salvo in 30. Jackson out. He clung to the rock, half blinded by smoke and dust, senses pulled in too many directions at once. The jungle had become a cauldron, artillery blasts, crackling rifle fire, the shriek of splinters, the deep throat hit of his own M79. Up on the spur, one man anchored it all, mind split between calling corrections and hunting targets, knowing that on this ground, under this sky, he and the NVA platoon were now tied together by steel and blood. Artillery did what artillery always does when it is well called and relentlessly adjusted. It peeled away the jungle's protection and stripped the fight down to its ugliest essentials. Within minutes, the certain death saddle was a churned scar instead of a shaded corridor, a moonscape of craters and splintered trunks. Smoke coiled along the ground, hugging the contours like something alive. Between salvos, the valley hung suspended in a ragged silence, broken only by the ringing in his ears and the sharp cracks of his own rifle. Those pauses were his hunting windows. While the guns reloaded, he became the precise instrument that followed up their blunt force. He saw an NVA soldier dragging a wounded comrade through the haze, both men stumbling toward the tree line on the western edge. One round from the Car-15 hit the rescuer high in the torso and dropped him. The wounded man tried to crawl alone, claws digging into the dirt. The next shell landed nearby and erased both in a blast of dirt, leaves, and fire. He spotted a pair trying to rush up the left side, hugging a shallow fold in the terrain. He let them get just far enough that turning back would be as deadly as going forward, then opened up with the captured RPD. The gun hammered in his hands, the belt sliding through the feed tray, muzzle climbing as it chewed the air. One runner crumpled mid-stride. The second dove into a clump of brush, disappearing from view. Rourke let him vanish rather than waste a belt chasing ghosts. The NVA adapted quickly. Their firing shifted from panicked bursts into something more controlled. Teams used craters and blown trees as stepping stones to inch across the kill zone. They stopped bunching. Fire probed his position from multiple angles instead of one. Even amid chaos, their training showed. They knew there was an artillery observer above them. Their new mission was simple: find him and kill him. Red Eye 3-1, Jackson, the radio crackled. Battery reports 2 more full salvos of HE, then they'll be black for at least 1-5 mics. Confirm? The words dropped cold into his mind. Roger, Jackson, he replied. 2 more salvos. Enemy elements still in saddle and attempting to flank. I'll mark for final fires. After that, I'll be on my own. Over. A brief pause, softer this time. Copy, Red Eye 3-1. We're tracking. Do what you have to. Jackson, out. He could feel the fight tightening around him. Ammunition check. 3 nearly full magazines, 3 partly used. Around 130 rounds. 9 grenades left for the M79. 2 claymores undetonated, wires snaking down the slope. Enough to hurt the enemy badly. Not enough to waste. Down below, 2 small groups began to move with purpose. On his right, 4 men slipped into a rocky ravine that paralleled the spur, disappearing into its shadowed gut. On his left, 3 more, their RPG man in the middle, used bomb craters as stepping stones, pausing only when blasts shook the ground. Their fire, when it came, went not at random into the trees, but into likely notches on the spur's crest, testing him, trying to get him to reveal a pattern. He shifted position again, ribs screaming as he dragged his wounded side across stone. He brought himself tight to the claymore clacker that covered the ravine and studied the shadows below. A glimpse of a helmet here, the ghost of a rifle barrel there. They were moving with the same slow, careful rhythm he'd seen in the saddle. Professionals doing a professional job. He called another adjustment, this one targeted at the flankers. Left 200 down 100 from last impact. Fire for effect, he told Jackson. The next salvo landed right where the NVA team had been massing. The blasts tossing bodies and rocks into the air, shredding saplings, turning the ravine into a boiling funnel. When the second-to-last salvo finished, the valley fell into a stunned quiet. The jungle's normal sounds, the cicadas' distant bird calls, had not yet come back. Only the smell of explosives and raw earth hung in the air. Red Eye 3-1 Jackson. Final he salvo available. Say when. Over. He watched the saddle. Survivors still moved, though fewer now. A man crawled among the craters, dragging a leg that didn't work anymore. Another clung to a broken tree, firing sporadically up at the spur, more gesture than threat. The two remaining flank elements, reduced but not erased, continued their slow creep. On his right, a shadow slipped closer along the ravine wall, almost level with the base of the spur. On his left, the RPG team edged into position behind a low rise. They were tired. They were scared. They were still coming. He knew the geometry. If he let them close much more, artillery would do as much damage to him as to them. If he didn't use the final salvo at all, he would face whatever remained of the platoon alone, with little ammo and a bleeding leg, in failing light. There weren't many elegant choices left. He keyed the radio. "Jackson, this is Red Eye 3-1. Final fire mission, my grid," he said. "Repeat, my grid. Danger close 50 meters. Bring it down on saddle and base of this spur. Confirm." The net went very still. Then, "Red Eye 3-1 Jackson. Confirm last. You are requesting he on your own location. Danger close 50 meters. Over." "Affirm," he said. "If you don't hit them, they'll hit me. Send it. Copy. Rounds outbound. Time to splash. 4-5 seconds. Jackson out." 45 seconds. He dropped the handset, wrapped one hand around the claymore clacker and waited. The first NVA helmet appeared in the ravine, just below a pair of protruding rocks. Another followed, then the hint of a shoulder. On the left, a man rose to one knee, trying to line up his RPG. Rourke squeezed the clacker. The claymore's blast punched the ravine like a hammer, its fan of steel balls shredding the creeping team. One man screamed once before the echo cut him off. The RPG man flinched toward the sound, his head turning. The sky inhaled. Shells hit. The explosion that landed below him felt like the earth had jumped. A wave of force picked him up and slammed him backward into stone. The world became noise and light, white flash, black dust, then nothing but roaring. Secondary blasts walked along the saddle and the base of the spur, each one slamming his body as if the ridge itself were punching him. Trees disintegrated, rocks cracked, shrapnel scythed through everything that lived. Something hot and jagged stabbed into his right thigh. He tasted blood as his teeth cut into his own lip. For an unknown stretch of seconds or minutes, his world was reduced to pain, spinning sky, and the suffocating weight of the blast. When the barrage finally ceased, silence dropped like a curtain. He lay there, staring up through a jagged hole where canopy used to be, lungs dragging in dusty air. The high whistle in his ears had become a single, shrill note. His leg burned. When he reached down, his hand came away slick with blood. Probing fingers found a piece of metal buried in muscle rather than a gaping arterial tear. Bad, but survivable. His ribs felt like broken glass when he breathed. He crawled back to the edge of the rocks and forced himself to look. The certain death saddle was no longer a trail. It was a cratered, smoking wound across the ridge. Bodies lay twisted among the splintered trees and fresh pits. Weapons, packs, and helmets were scattered like children's toys. Here and there, movement, a hand twitching, a figure trying to drag itself toward cover, a man attempting to raise a rifle with arms that shook. He raised the CAR-15 and began to shoot, not in anger, but with grim mechanical purpose. Any man who could still bring a weapon to bear on the spur was a danger. He put rounds into those shapes, one at a time, as efficiently as he had once put cattle down with a single shot back home. It was ugly work. It was also the difference between finishing this fight alive or not finishing it at all. After several minutes, the targets dwindled. The smoke thinned. The jungle sounds, flattened by the bombardment, started to creep back in around the edges. Somewhere deeper in the valley, a whistle blew, a high, reedy sound. Faint orders drifted up in Vietnamese. Whoever commanded whatever was left of the NVA forces in the area was pulling them back. The last survivors of the platoon faded into the trees, leaving their dead in the churned earth. Rourke let the rifle sag. He had done the job. A full NVA platoon had tried to cross certain death that day and been cut apart by artillery and one man on a rock. But satisfaction was a luxury. He was alone on a shattered spur, wounded, with no artillery left, and the light was dying. The battle on the saddle had ended. His fight to make it out of the valley alive was only shifting into a new phase. Twilight in the A Shau Valley was not a gentle dimming. It was a theft. One moment the jungle held color, greens, browns, the sickly grey of smoke, and the next it all sank into blue-black shadow. On the spur above the ruined saddle, Jack Rourke felt the day slip out of his hands as surely as if someone had flipped a switch. He checked his watch. Just past 1900 hours. He had been fighting for hours, moving, calling fire, bleeding. His right thigh throbbed in a steady, mean rhythm. The improvised bandage he'd wrapped around it had gone dark and stiff. His ribs protested every breath, but the radio's antenna still stood, and when he pressed the handset to his ear, it still hissed. "Fire Base Jackson, this is Red Eye 3-1, he said, voice hoarse. "Artillery effective. Enemy platoon in saddle destroyed as organized unit. Estimate 20 plus KIA visible. Unknown number withdrew into jungle. I am wounded in leg and ribs, but operational. Request extraction options before full dark. Over." Static filled the pause. When the lieutenant spoke, his words were wrapped in atmospheric crackle. "Red Eye 3-1 Jackson. Roger your sitrep. Weather still lousy. Low clouds. Ceiling hugging the ridgelines. Slicks can't get in safely right now, and nearest secure LZ is hot. You may have to sit tight until first light. Over." Sit tight. Rourke glanced around his perch. Black rocks, a few shredded trees, the steep drops on either side. Night here belonged comfortably to the enemy. "Roger Jackson," he said. "Be advised my position will draw attention. Expect NVA recon or follow-on elements. I'll maintain radio watch and report movement. If you can get gunships overhead later for flares or suppression, I'll take anything. Over." "We copy, Red Eye," the lieutenant replied. There was a brief hesitation, then, "Battalion CO wants you to know your actions are noted. Jackson, out. Actions are noted." In some other war, that phrase might have come with the assumption of dress uniforms, citations, and handshakes. Up on the spur, in the thickening dark, it sounded closer to a line on a future memorial. He took stock. 4 magazines left, 2 nearly full, 2 half down, 5 grenades for the M79. 1 claymore still wired and waiting. The spur offered commanding fields of fire, but little in the way of concealment now that artillery had stripped away much of the foliage. He dragged himself farther back from the lip and began to rebuild what cover he could, stacking fragments of rock, pulling in bits of shattered branch to break up his outline. He forced himself to eat a little, hard biscuits that turned to paste in his mouth, and to drink from his canteen. Bandaging the leg again hurt enough to grey his vision around the edges. He did it anyway. Pain meant he was still here. Numbness would have been worse. As the last traces of daylight faded, night sounds rose from the valley. Frogs croaked from unseen pools. Insects started their high electric whine. Somewhere far off, a single mortar boomed. That sound could have been friend or foe. Out here, it hardly mattered. What mattered were the noises closer in. A twig snapping where no twig should, the scrape of something hard against rock. The NVA had decisions of their own to make. They could chalk up the massacre on the saddle to bad luck and American firepower, bypass the spur entirely and continue their invisible war elsewhere. Or they could decide that leaving a lone American observer alive above a key route was unacceptable. Doctrine, pride, and practical sense all pushed toward the second choice. Ours blurred. His world shrank to arcs and angles. The slice of ground he could see, the dead zones he could not, the routes he would choose if he were the one climbing up to kill the man on the rock. He rehearsed responses in his head. fighting the temptation to let his eyes close for more than a heartbeat. Fatigue pressed at him from every side as insistently as the jungle heat. Close to midnight, the first probe came. A faint metallic clink floated up from the left flank, followed by a slow, deliberate rustle. Rourke shifted his attention away from the obvious path straight up the spur and focused on a narrow ledge he'd noted earlier, a shelf of rock that may be 2 men wide, skirting the slope beneath him. It was exactly the route he would have chosen in their place. Something darker than the darkness moved along that ledge, slow, careful. A man who knew how to stalk. Rourke's hand found the claymore clacker. He held still, letting the figure creep closer. At 10 meters, the shape paused, listening. At 5, it had no choice but to squeeze between 2 rocky outcrops. He squeezed the clacker. The claymore detonated with a flat, brutal bang, its fan of steel balls blasting across the ledge. For a heartbeat, the night became hard white light, rock and shadow etched in stark negative. A strangled cry cut through the dark, then nothing but the echo and the rattle of fragments. AK fire surged up in response, wild but plentiful, stitching the crest of the spur and shredding what foliage remained. Rounds cracked off stone, throwing chips into his face. One whined past close enough that he felt the air of its passage. He hugged the rocks and let the burst burn itself out. "Jackson, this is Red-Eye 3-1, he whispered when the firing died. "Contact, enemy probing left flank. 1 claymore expended, probable KIA. Sporadic small arms from tree line, no visual on larger force, over. Red-Eye 3-1 Jackson, copy contact. Gunship still grounded. Weather starting to lift on eastern approaches, but nothing for you yet. Stay low. Out. Stay low." That part he had mastered. The rest of the night came in pulses, stretches of suffocating stillness broken by tiny spikes of fear when some new sound hinted at movement below. Once he heard what sounded like quiet voices far down slope, a murmur that rose and fell and then was gone. Once, a single flare popped far to the east, its cold white light flickering against the underside of the clouds. Some other fight, some other unit. His leg throbbed, his back burned where rock had rubbed raw through fabric. Sleep pressed hard at the edges of his consciousness. He fought it with small, stupid games, naming the rivers in Oregon he'd fished as a kid, reciting radio procedures in his head, counting his own breaths. Around 0400, a different sound crept into the mix. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks. Then the low chop grew into a distinct rhythm, rotor blades beating heavy, damp air. He grabbed the handset. "Jackson, Red-Eye 3-1, I have faint rotor noise east of my position. Confirm air assets are up, over." "Red-Eye 3-1, Jackson." "Affirm," the lieutenant said, sounding a little more alive. "Ceilings lifted in some sectors. We've got a pair of slicks and 2 gunships moving toward your vicinity. Call signs Eagle Flight and Widowmaker. They'll hold until we can find them a safe LZ. Stand by. Over." Hope flared, sharp and dangerous. He forced himself to treat it like any other tool, useful, but not something to lean on too hard. As the eastern sky began to pale, he scanned the ridgeline south of his position. The spur was useless as a landing site, and the saddle was a cratered grave. But a little farther along, he saw a small break in the trees, a ragged clearing maybe 20 meters across, with scrub instead of full canopy. Not ideal, not impossible. "Jackson, Red-Eye 3-1, he said. "I have a possible LZ south of my position. Grid WT 293645. Small clearing on ridgeline, moderate brush, limited canopy. I can move to it, but I'll be exposed for 200 meters. Over." A new voice cut in, edged with the clipped confidence of a man who'd flown through a lot of flak. "Red-Eye 3-1, this is Widowmaker lead. Copy your LZ. We can probably drop a bird into that hole if you mark it with smoke on our run. Can you move under your own power?" He looked at his bandaged leg, then at the jungle between him and that patch of ground. "Affirmative," he said. "Slow, but I'll get there." Be advised, enemy remnants likely still in area. Over. Roger that, Widowmaker replied. We'll be overhead in 5. When I call for it, pop smoke. Widowmaker out. Rourke checked his gear with stiff, deliberate movements. He slung the Car-15 across his chest, the M79 over his shoulder, and secured the radio to his harness. He took one last look at the ruined saddle and the bodies scattered there, men who had followed orders into a kill zone, because that was what soldiers did, on both sides of any front. Then he turned away from certain death and began the slow, painful move toward a chance at leaving it behind. On the topo map, the distance between the spur and the clearing was just a finger width along a contour line. In real terrain, with a shredded thigh and bruised ribs, it became a grind worthy of its own battle streamer. The ridgeline pitched and rolled. Mud sucked at his boots. Vines grabbed his ankles. Every time his injured leg took weight, hot pain flared up his side. He moved in bursts, 10 meters of awkward, half-limping scramble, drop behind a rock, listen, scan. Another 5, using fallen trunks as both handholds and cover. The Car-15 traveled in his hands like a third crutch, muzzle sweeping, ready to snap up at any sign of movement. Twice he heard something that made him freeze. Once it was only a macaque crashing through branches, indignant at the new shapes in its world. The second time, it was human. 4 figures slipped along a contour line on the opposite slope. Shadows in green uniforms against deeper green jungle, rifles slung but not forgotten. They glanced toward the spur he'd left, saw only smoke and devastation, and continued on. Reinforcements arriving too late, or survivors slipping away. He couldn't tell. Either way, he let them pass. Picking a long-range fight now would serve no purpose but to tempt fate. The rotor noise grew, resolving into 2 distinct sounds, the deeper thump of transport Hueys and the harsher, higher pitch of gunships. Then thunder joined engine noise, the dull, distant crump of rockets slamming into suspected positions as the Cobras or gunships began their pre-landing sweep. Red Eye 3-1, Widowmaker lead, came the pilot's voice, louder now. We're 2 clicks out. On your mark, we'll swing over that ridgeline. You pop smoke when I call it. Over. Widowmaker lead, Red Eye 3-1, copy. He answered, breath ragged. Approaching LZ now, I'll be ready. The clearing appeared suddenly through the trees, a raw patch of dirt and low scrub on the ridge crest, ringed by higher jungle. It looked smaller than it had from above. Clearings in Vietnam always did, when you were the one standing in them, listening for enemy fire. The first Huey roared overhead, fast, crossing the ridge to make a wider circuit. The gunships followed, their shadows flicking across the canopy. One hosed a burst from its minigun into a clump of suspicious-looking trees to the north, the sound a drawn-out metallic snarl. Another lobbed a pair of rockets into a gully near the saddle. The message was plain. Stay down. Red Eye 3-1, Widowmaker lead. In position. Pop smoke. Rourke pulled a smoke grenade, yanked the pin, and tossed it into the center of the clearing. A moment later, thick purple smoke boiled up, turning in the rotor wash like a living thing. Got your purple, Widowmaker said. We're coming in. Gunships will keep the edges honest. Be ready to move. Widowmaker, out. The Huey dropped into view, nose slightly high, rotor disc flaring as the pilot bled off speed. It hovered a foot or 2 above the uneven ground, skids flexing, rotor wash flattening the brush and slamming hot wind into Rourke's face. The world narrowed to the rectangle of the open door. A crew chief in a flak vest and helmet leaned out, one hand on the M60 in the doorway, the other gesturing wildly. "Move it! Let's go!" he yelled, words shredded by engine noise. Rourke gritted his teeth and pushed his body forward. The last 10 meters felt longer than the whole climb up the spur. His wounded leg buckled once. He caught himself on his hands, scrambled back up, and lunged for the skid. The crew chief grabbed his harness and hauled, muscles straining, dragging him into the cabin. "Got him!" the crew chief shouted, slapping the side of the Huey twice. "Up, up, up!" The helicopter surged skyward, banking away from the clearing. Tracers rose from the tree line, bright orange sparks slicing through the air, a last stubborn attempt from some NVA gunner who refused to let them go uncontested. The crew chief leaned out and answered with a controlled burst from the M60, brass casings pouring out in a glittering arc, barrel shuddering in his hands. Wind tore at everything. The A Shau Valley stretched beneath them, green and brown and black, riddled with scars where shells and bombs had torn into the earth. Through the open door, Rourke saw the certain death saddle one last time from the air. It was no longer the subtle dip he'd seen on the map. It was a raw, gouged seam in the ridge, ringed by torn trees. He let his head thump back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Voices crackled over the intercom, call signs, grids, one friendly exfilled, light damage, enemy fire ineffective. The sort of sterile phrases that turned chaos into something that looked tidy in a logbook. At Firebase Jackson, medics met the bird with stretchers. Bright light hit his eyes after so many hours of grey. They cut the fabric away from his leg, muttering as they exposed the wound. Someone remarked on the amount of shrapnel lodged in his thigh. Someone else listened to his chest and nodded, satisfied that the damage to his ribs wasn't collapsing a lung. An IV slid into his arm. Morphine followed. The edges of the world softened. "Lucky bastard," one medic said to another, not knowing he could hear. "They're saying he took out a whole damn platoon by himself up there." Lucky, he thought dimly, had nothing to do with it. It had been skill, training, artillery, one bad decision by an NVA platoon leader, and one good decision to call fire on his own grid. The space between those things was where men lived or died. He spent days in a field hospital, then was moved to Da Nang for surgery to pull metal from his leg. The ribs knit slowly. The nights took longer. In sleep he sometimes felt the clacker in his hand again, heard the slow count to splash, saw the saddle erupt. He woke with his heart pounding and the ghost of cordite in his nose. The army turned certain death into paper. After-action reports listed times, grids, unit designations. Casualty counts went into neat columns. Citations were drafted. Staff Sergeant John Patrick Rourke distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions. One award narrative began. Numbers followed. Enemy KIA estimated, friendly wounded, ordnance expended. His Silver Star recommendation was bumped to a Distinguished Service Cross after the battalion commander read the full account. Outside the paperwork, the story traveled in a different form. Grunts in other outfits heard about a Green Beret who'd sat on a rock and shot down an NVA platoon alone. Details shifted in retelling. Some versions had him armed only with an M16. Others gave him a heavy machine gun and a whole team. Sometimes UROM became a larger presence. Sometimes he vanished from the story entirely. The nickname of the place, though, stayed the same. Certain Death. Rourke stayed in country long enough to finish his tour, then signed on for another, shorter one. He didn't end up alone on a spur again, but Vietnam had no shortage of hard corners. He led raids, trained more CIDG fighters, slipped along trails at night, listening for the soft click of enemy weapons. Eventually, when the weariness in his bones outpaced whatever was left for him to do, he rotated home. Oregon took him back with cold rivers and wide skies. He bought a little land near where he'd grown up. Mornings smelled like pine and damp soil instead of rot and smoke. Nights were quiet enough that the slightest wind sounded louder than artillery had in the valley. Sometimes that wind rattled the windows just right, and he was back on the spur, counting seconds to splash, feeling the ridge jump under him when the shells landed. He didn't tell many people the full story. When he did open up with other veterans over beers, he talked less about numbers and more about choices, when to fire the first shot, when to call danger close on himself, when to stop shooting because the men down there weren't a threat anymore. He talked too about the NVA. They were good, he would say quietly, disciplined, brave. They walked into that saddle because some commander told them to, same as me, sitting up on that rock because somebody told me to. We all thought we were the ones in the right. The ground didn't care. The saddle itself changed. Later operations scuffed new scars into it. The jungle began, slowly, to erase the craters. Vines crawled over shattered trunks. Grass threaded through churned earth. Rain filled small pits and turned them into stagnant pools. To someone walking the ridge years later, it would look like any other piece of bad ground. Oddly open, maybe, with different-looking trees. Only if they listened closely, they might feel something in the air there. Some residue of the day when one platoon walked in and did not walk out. Incidents like certain death never made the large print of history in the way that named offensives did. Yet they were the war. Not slogans, not lines on a map, but moments when a handful of men on both sides found themselves jammed into a small patch of earth, forced to decide in seconds how to live or kill or die. One Green Beret on a spur, one NVA platoon on a trail, one lieutenant in a firebase making the call to fire on his own observer. It was in these knots of decision that Vietnam's true story lived. Rourke's stand showed how overwhelming firepower and advanced radios mattered, but never by themselves. They needed a human being to read the land, to judge the risk of calling shells close, to keep fighting when instinct screamed to run. It showed, too, that even a day like that, when a single man helps break a platoon, could not change the broader arc. The NVA would send more men, the valley would see more fire, the war would grind on, indifferent to heroism or sacrifice, and it left the kind of questions that linger long after parades and protests fade. How much of survival is skill, and how much is chance? What do you owe to the men you killed because they would have killed you? What does it mean to be remembered for a day when you lived because others didn't? If you've stayed with this story from that rain-heavy afternoon in A Shau to the quiet of whatever room you're in now, take a moment to think about the men who walked those valleys, on every side of the line. If someone you know stood a watch in Vietnam, or humped a ridge, or flew into a clearing like the one that pulled Rourke out, tell us about them in the comments. And if these hidden corners of that war matter to you, consider staying with us here. There are more forgotten ridgelines, more unnamed saddles, more small fights that shaped an entire generation waiting to be pulled back into the light.